so when we left off, we were looking, or we had already looked at two of the four major biological molecules. So we had looked at carbohydrates and lipids, and now we're going to look at proteins and just spend just a couple minutes on nucleic acids because we have a whole chapter on DNA and RNA later on in the course. So when we left off on the course outline, we were over on page 21 and in the text on page 75 looking now at protein. So we want to move to that. So again, we're on concept 5.4, page 21 in the course outline, and now we're looking at proteins. So just to recap a little bit, when we talked about carbs and lipids, those are both a source of what? What do we need carbs for? Energy, exactly. And how do we store energy? In the form of fat. So if you look at your energy requirements, the more energy required, the more carbs you need. But if you eat more carbs than your energy requirement, you're going to convert those carbohydrates to fat and store them, and vice versa. So in order to maintain your weight, you would balance out your energy requirement with your carbohydrate intake. Now when it comes to proteins, it's a little bit different. Proteins are the structural stuff in the cell. And so they're really involved in building all of the structural things. So when you look at your organs, organ systems, all of that stuff, hair, nails, everything. When you look around, you're looking at each other, what you're looking at are proteins. So they're a hugely diverse group. It consists, or they account for more than 50% of the dry mass in most cells, and they have many diverse structures and functions. So we're going to be looking at all the things that proteins are important for, and I'm going to start with a look at proteins, and also is there a difference between proteins? So we've talked about good carbs and bad carbs. We say complex carbohydrates are better, stay away from white carbs. We talked about good fats, bad fats, saturated fats tend to be stickier, plus they're of animal origin and have cholesterol, which is also sticky, can cause cardiovascular problems. And now, what about proteins? Are there good proteins and bad proteins? So let's start with this clip.
Foods, including animal and plant-based proteins, can also vary enormously in their quality and their implications for our long-term health. Proteins are often said to act as building blocks for the lean tissues in our bodies, but they serve many other important functions in body regulation, support of immune function, and a variety of other roles in our physiology. There are 20 types of amino acids needed to fulfill all of these functions, but only 9 of them are essential, meaning that our bodies can't make enough of them, so we rely on getting these from our food. In general, animal sources of protein like fish and eggs provide all of the essential amino acids in high enough concentrations that these foods are called complete protein sources. In contrast, plant-based protein sources like beans, lentils, nuts, and tofu tend to be incomplete sources of protein. It might seem that since plant-based proteins are incomplete in their nutrient content, that they're nutritionally inferior compared with animal-based proteins. But in fact, the health benefits of substituting plant-based proteins for animal-based ones, ideally a few days a week, this far outweighs the risk of falling short on essential amino acids. Plant-based proteins can be combined with other foods to provide a complete amino acid profile. In fact, many traditional food combinations like corn and black beans or rice and lentils are based on the principle of combining complementary proteins. Meals that contain vegetarian sources of protein also contain more fiber and less fat, especially saturated fat, than meals that feature animal-based protein. And even though saturated fat may not be as harmful as we once thought, it can still contribute to elevated levels of LDL cholesterol if we eat too much of it. So moderating our intake of red meat, for example, is still a sensible idea. In general, the typical Western diet contains more animal-based protein than we need to sustain good health.
People who eat lots of plant foods, plant-based diets, tend to have much better health and better longevity than people who eat a heavy meat diet.
So if you're thinking of trying a low-carb, high-protein diet, it's important to pay attention to the kinds of proteins that are being consumed and in what quantities. A diet high in animal protein, especially if it's poor quality animal protein, like processed meat or high-fat cuts of meat. This kind of diet can be harmful to our health, even if it leads to weight loss in the short term. Processed meats often contain nitrates, used as a preservative, which can damage blood vessels and contribute to hardening of the arteries. These meats also tend to be very high in sodium, which can be a contributor to high blood pressure. The most sensible diets are usually those that encourage us to eat moderate amounts of high-quality protein foods. These should come from a variety of different sources, including some fish if possible, as well as plenty of vegetarian sources of protein that are combined for completeness.
So one thing they didn't mention there is casein. Casein is milk protein, and there's been a lot of studies done that have shown that casein promotes tumor growth in cancers. So that's why you hear a lot of people staying away from dairy these days. And in fact, some of our top athletes are going on plant-based diets. Even though they need a lot of protein for their muscle building, they feel it's healthier to do plant-based protein than animal-based protein. So the biggest problem with animal-based or plant-based protein is that you might hear it doesn't include vitamin B12. As that video pointed out, if you balance out your proteins, you should get that, but you can always take a supplement if you're completely 100% only plant-based protein. Other than that, animal-based protein has a lot of other issues, including, as I mentioned, casein and other negative effects of your cardiovascular system. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that too, but let's talk about what is a protein and exactly how do we synthesize and hydrolyze them. We talked about that last time. Remember, synthesis is what? Building or breaking? Building, right, and hydrolysis, lysis is splitting. So we do this with all of our major nutrients, and usually when we're eating protein, we're getting it in the form of a complex polymer, right, large, more macromolecule. We have to break it down or hydrolyze it, which, as you know, requires water. So looking at then some of the different kinds of proteins we have in the body. And if you're following in the text, this is over on page 76, looking at, for instance, this is an extremely important protein. All of our enzymes, which make all of our metabolic reactions occur, are protein-based. So we have a whole chapter we're going to come back to. We've even got a lab on enzymes and how they make or break different reactions in the body. So without those proteins, we would have no metabolic reactions at all. We have our defense proteins. Those are involved in our immune responses. Proteins called antibodies that mark foreign invaders for attack. So if you get a bacterial or viral infection, one of the first things on the spot are these proteins that mark it, hopefully, so that your immune cells can identify them and take care of it before it causes a problem for you. We have storage proteins that we find in things like eggs. The albumin of eggs, the egg white, is 100% pure protein. And then we have transport proteins that we'll talk about when we get to the cell membrane and how things move across the cell membrane. There are proteins that actually act as little shuttles that move things back and forth. So those are in the cell membrane. We have many of our hormones that are protein-based, so you can see something like insulin. Remember, anytime you eat carbs, you have an insulin reaction because when you eat a carb, your blood sugar goes up. And just like cholesterol, we don't want it in the blood, we want it in the cells where it belongs. So insulin is a hormone, it's a protein-based hormone that converts glucose to glycogen and stores it in the liver. So it maintains your blood sugar levels, a very important protein there. We have regulator proteins that respond to cells really regulating other cells. So we have these signaling proteins and receptor proteins that respond to them. Things like, for instance, when your nerves send a signal from one neuron to another, those would be involved. So receptor proteins, as the name implies, receive signals. We have our muscles that are made up of things like contractile and motor proteins. Anytime you hear the word motor, think of movement. Just like a motor moves a car, motor proteins move things around the cell and ultimately help us move. Our muscles work by sliding past these filaments, slide past one another as our muscles contract, and then when our muscles relax, they slide back out again. So we'll be talking about actin and myosin a little bit. If you study anatomy and physiology, you spend a lot of time learning about the muscular system. There we go. And then we have all the stuff, as I mentioned, all the structural stuff, your organs, organ systems, your hair, your nails, all of that is protein-based. So proteins are very, very essential. The way that we build proteins or synthesize, there's that word synthesize proteins, is based on these functional groups I mentioned earlier. This is the amine group that has nitrogen, and the carboxyl group here, C double bond OOH, this gives it the name acid. So we have an amine and an acid group, hence the name amino acid. We also have an R group here. This R is kind of like X in algebra. It varies, and that's what makes one amino acid different from another. But they come together here, the OH of one, the H of another, and notice water is going out as a product. If water is going out, is that hydrating or dehydrating? Water going out. Dehydrating, right? So that's dehydration synthesis. We are then bring these two together, and we have this special bond shown in red here called a peptide bond. So anytime you hear peptide, think protein. Peptide, protein, peptide, protein. That's what holds the amino acids together. If you have two amino acids, what's the word for two? Two? How about three? Tri. Two is di. So if you had two, it would be a dipeptide. Three, a tripeptide, and many would be what? What's the word for many? Poly. There you go. So anytime you see this word, folks, polypeptide. Peptide means protein, poly means many. This is a large complex protein. So polypeptide chain is the same as a protein. And when we digest them down or hydrolyze them, remember they're going to be broken down into their building blocks, which are, what's the building block of a protein? Just talked about it, begins with an A. Amino acids, exactly. So these are showing you just some of our different amino acids, and what makes one different from another, again, is that R group, which is shown here in green or up here in yellow or down here in blue. So they all have the amine group on one side, the acid on the other, and this is what makes them different. And because of that, they're going to behave a little bit differently as well. So if you've ever taken amino acid supplements, some of these terms might look familiar. You may have heard, for instance, of tryptophan. This is an amino acid that we find, for instance, in turkey that people say makes you drowsy after eating a turkey dinner. So there's lots of different amino acids. Some of our sugar substitutes are made with amino acids because, remember, we don't store excess amino acids. They just go through us, and that's why those sugar substitutes don't have any calories really, because you're not having to break them down and you're not going to store them, so you won't gain weight. So when we look at a protein and how it works, what really becomes important to understand is that they work based on their structure. And it's kind of like puzzle pieces. If you ever do puzzles, you know you can't build a puzzle unless the pieces fit together. That's how proteins work. They're based on fit, and the fit is determined by their structure. So we have several different levels of structure that we're going to look at now. First, this clip on protein structure.
elements constructed from the same set of 20 different amino acids. The primary structure is the specific sequence of amino acids specified by the gene. In the secondary structure, portions of the protein begin to coil and fold into unique three-dimensional formations. Two kinds of secondary structure units are the alpha helix and the beta-pleated sheet. The folds and coils of the protein are the result of hydrogen bonds that occur at regular intervals. The tertiary structure is formed by interactions between side chains of various amino acids. At this stage, some proteins are complete. Other proteins incorporate multiple polypeptide subunits, creating what is known as the quaternary structure.
Okay, so again, we have these 4 different levels of protein structure, and we start with the primary structure. The primary structure, as it shows here, looks like a beaded chain, and the reason that they show it this way is because every one of these beads represents an amino acid. And so if we linked all those amino acids together by what kind of bonds form between amino acids? Because of the P? Peptides, remember peptide bonds, right? So all these beads are connected via peptide bonds, and we have a long straight chain of these amino acids. That would be the primary structure. But then what happens in the secondary structure is that these amino acids start interacting and they form hydrogen bonds, shown here with the red dots, because what do you know about hydrogen bonds? Are they strong or weak bonds between molecules? Weak, so they always show them as a dotted line because they're easy to break. But what will happen is that once these hydrogen bonds start forming, it causes the protein to take on a secondary structure, which involves a 3-dimensional view now. So in the primary structure, you don't have a 3D view, but starting with the secondary structure, you either have this beta-pleated sheet, as you see here, almost looks like if you've ever made a paper fan, how you fold it that way, or you could have this helical shape that you may have seen if you've ever studied DNA, has this sort of twisted ladder shape that you see here. And then this is the alpha helix shape. So that's a secondary structure based on hydrogen bonds. So on your course outline, where we're defining these structures, page 22, for the primary structure, you want to underline peptide bond, because the primary structure is based on peptide bonds. And then we get into the 3-dimensional structure. In the secondary structure, it is based on hydrogen bonds. So you want to underline hydrogen bonds there for the secondary structure. And then going on to the tertiary structure, now what happens here is these R groups start interacting. Remember, the R groups are kind of like X's in algebra. They start interacting, and that causes the protein to start folding back on itself. So we have what's known as a globular protein. So the tertiary structure is due to the R group. So you want to underline R groups there. And then the quaternary structure is when you have 2 or more chains interacting. So I always use the, so for the quaternary structure, underline 2 or more. And I always use the analogy of a slinky. You guys remember this toy? One of these. It's one of my favorites. But if we take this slinky and stretch it all the way out, that would be like going to this primary structure. And then once it starts forming the coil, as you see here, that would be an example of the secondary structure. And then what happens to slinkies after a while? They get all tangled up, right? And that would be similar to the tertiary structure, and then the quaternary structure is if I had 2 or more slinkies and got them really tangled up. Now I have a big globular mess, so to speak. But that mess is responsible for getting all of those jobs done. Everything from making metabolic reactions occur via enzymes to making your organs, organ systems, hair, nails, all of that stuff. And your immune system work. So those are the levels of protein structure. So what determines a protein structure? And as it says here, in addition to the primary structure, physical and chemical conditions can affect structure. And there are 2 major things that affect a protein structure: pH and temperature. So what happens, let's go back to the egg. The albumin of an egg, right, the egg white, is protein-based. And when you put that on a frying pan, when you're cooking an egg, what happens to that clear protein? What does it do? It turns white. What happened there is you just denatured the protein. In other words, it's like taking this slinky and stretching it all the way out. It lost its shape. It's still a slinky, it's just not working anymore. It's lost its shape, and so in that case, we say the protein has been denatured. The bad thing about denatured proteins is once they lose their shape, they can't function anymore. They're still a protein, but they're non-functional. And can you go back and unfry an egg? No, and so it's very difficult. You can reverse protein denaturation, but it's very difficult. So when proteins in our body are exposed to high temperatures, they can actually denature. This is why getting a fever is so dangerous. If you start denaturing your proteins, you start losing your enzymes, for instance, then all your metabolic processes are going to shut down and you die. So that's why a high fever can actually kill you. Likewise, people who suffer blood acidosis or alkalosis or any other pH problem in their system will denature enzymes. So when we get to the chapter on enzymes, we're going to do a whole lab looking at the effect of temperature and pH on enzymes. But for now, or not, well, on enzymes, but for now, just remember that when a protein loses its three-dimensional shape, if I take this slinky and stretch it out, it's still a slinky, it's still a protein, it just is a non-functional one. And that should not be confused because there's a question on the test that says, if you denature a protein, do you still have a protein? Yes, you just have a stretched out protein, right? A single dimension. If you completely hydrolyze a protein, now hydrolysis, remember, breaks down the molecules to their unit molecules. What's the unit molecule of a protein? What's the building block? Amino acids. So if you hydrolyze a protein, you have amino acids. No longer is it a protein. If you denature a protein, you have a protein that has lost its shape, but it's still a protein. So you may have heard people say, well, remember Rocky, the movie Rocky, and how he always ate raw eggs? Is that better than eating a cooked egg? Well, think about it. A cooked egg, at least is all the way stretched out. The only thing you need to finish digesting the protein in a cooked egg is to just hydrolyze those peptide bonds. But if you eat a raw egg, now you got to go and add enough heat to denature the entire thing, and then you still have to hydrolyze it to amino acids. So it's not just from that standpoint alone, but what else is bad about eating raw eggs? Yeah, salmonella. They taste bad too, and they can have all kinds of stuff. So yeah, it's better to cook your food. It helps in digestion actually, and it will get you your amino acids even quicker. So a denatured protein then is biologically inactive. It's still a protein, it's just not working. So here's a clip I wanted to show you about how protein folding is important from a point of pharmaceuticals and medicine.
Stanford University.
One of the goals of computational biology is to be able to simulate biological systems like proteins or nucleic acids atom by atom. What these animations show is the process of how a protein folds. So it starts off completely unassembled, and then what it starts to do is organize itself into a folded structure. One of the interesting things about folding is that it's important not just for what biology works, but also what biology doesn't work. So protein misfolding is associated with many diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, ALS, and many others. What we've been able to do with folding at home is simulate the process of how Alzheimer's proteins misfold. And that led to very specific predictions that we were able to test recently. The next steps that we've been working on is to use those results to predict what possibly might be interesting lead compounds for future therapeutics. Protein folding has really been a grand problem for many decades, and it's such a fundamental part of biophysics and biology. And so from a basic science point of view, I think this is a really exciting problem.
So that just shows you how important protein folding is for the functioning of protein, and when they are misfolded or unfolded, it can cause a lot of problems in the body. So there's also the next and last section talks about nucleic acids. So this is a group that involves DNA and RNA, nucleic acids. That's the NA in DNA and RNA. And so we will come back actually later and talk a lot more about it, but for now, since we're really just talking about the structure of these molecules, just understand that nucleic acids are involved in making things like DNA and RNA, and that the building block of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. Don't get that mixed up with fatty acids and lipids. Lipids are made up of fatty acids and glycerol. Those are the unit molecules, but nucleic acids are actually the macromolecule made up of nucleotides, which are the unit molecule. When we look at a nucleotide, it consists of really three things: a 5-carbon sugar, which we've talked about already. If it's RNA, for example, it's ribose. DNA, it's deoxyribose. A nitrogen-containing base, and a phosphate group. So when you look at a nucleotide structure, there you see the 5-carbon sugar in blue, the phosphate, as always, in yellow because it's highly energetic, and the nitrogenous base shown here, which will vary. If you've studied, for instance, DNA, you may have learned the 4 bases, A, T, G, and C, right? Adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. That's what those bases in DNA would be. So again, we'll come back to that when we talk about DNA and RNA. Put these nucleotides together, and here's your macromolecule, the nucleic acid. So again, keep in mind the nucleic acid is the macromolecule made up of nucleotides. If it's DNA, we would put 2 of these together because DNA, just like the slinky, is a double-sided helix. And that's really all I have for nucleic acids. Anyone have questions so far? Everybody good on those 4 molecules, how we synthesize, how we hydrolyze? And the last thing I wanted to wrap this chapter up with is, what should I eat? So I've told you about good carbs and bad carbs, good fats and bad fats, good proteins, bad proteins. And I don't know, how many of you have seen The Game Changers on Netflix? Anybody seen this yet? It's really making a big stir in diet for a lot of people because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our top athletes are going plant-based diet. So is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, in general, it seems to be a pretty good thing, and it's working for some of our top athletes. So a recent review in the journal Nutrients looked not only at the cardiovascular benefits of eating plant-based diets, but how they might affect athletic performance. And they found that avoiding meat and dairy products has shown to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, weight gain, and certain cancers. And I might even add that it's probably cheaper. And then they also found that eating more whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, beans, and nuts increases intake of dietary fiber, antioxidants, and phytonutrients, which could improve blood flow, reduce inflammation, and aid in weight control. So there's lots of good things about plant-based diets, and not only just, you might have heard a lot of people, everyone knows what a vegan is, right? So they avoid all animal products. But vegans, are they actually healthier? It depends, because on a vegan diet, you can still eat potato chips, you can still eat, some greasy French fries or whatever. So they're taking it to another step and saying not just vegan, but whole plant-based diet, which means instead of drinking apple juice or eating applesauce, just eat the apple. If it doesn't have a label on it, it's probably better for you because it hasn't been processed. The more processing, the more you don't know what's in your food. And so if you shop the outside of the grocery store, the produce aisle, things like that, where you find fresh stuff without labels, maybe you're better off. Are you for sure? I mean, again, these studies change every time I teach this, so I just show what is out there and what's the latest. But I did want to show you the clip from the Game Changers because it, as I said, has caused quite a bit of a stir, and a lot of people are changing their diet based on that. And these athletes are getting plenty of protein in order to continue playing, being at the top of their game. And in fact, a lot of them say they're way better than the top of their game. In this video, you guys know the ropes that people that work out, it's hard, right? The guy in this video started out his plant-based diet. He couldn't even do 10 minutes on a rope. In the end, he could do over an hour. He wasn't even tired. So how much of that is true, I don't know, but that's what you might see if you watch this video. It makes you want to try it anyway.
They ate a lot of meat. They showed us commercials of steak. That's what a man is.
Selling that idea that real man eat meat.
Serious, not food.
But you got to understand that's marketing. That's not based on reality.
I've been teaching fighting techniques to government agencies for more than 15 years. Then I got injured. Unable to teach for at least 6 months. I spent more than 1,000 hours studying science on recovery and nutrition. I stumbled across a study about the Roman gladiators.
The gladiators were predominantly vegetarian.
How could the original professional fighters be so powerful, eating only plants?
When I made the switch to a plant-based diet, I qualified for my third Olympic team. I broke 2 American records. I was like, man, I should have done this a long while ago.
When I went plant-based, I wasn't sure if I was going to survive. And I actually became like a machine.
One of the biggest misconceptions in sports nutrition is that we have to have animal protein to perform at a high level. That's just not true.
Sometimes you have to do things that you know your competitors aren't doing.
Today's blood and yesterday's blood.
I think this is going to wake a lot of people up.
I was recovering better, not getting as sore. This was our best season in the last 15 years, and we had 14 guys on plant-based diets.
We wouldn't feel great, have more energy.
Cholesterol, 276. Today, 169.
Whoa, now you're talking.
Most days, my age can keep up with the grandchildren. My grandchildren can't keep up with me.
It's not one set of dietary guidelines for improving your performance as an athlete. Another one for reversing heart disease, reversing diabetes. It's the same for all of them.
Someone asked me, how could you get as strong as an ox without eating any meat? And my answer was, have you ever seen an ox eating meat?
I love that. Have you ever seen an ox eating meat? It's pretty good. Anyway, stuff to think about. You guys have all the information now. You can make up your own mind about what you should and should not be eating. Does anyone have any questions for me before we go to the game show? I'm gonna